Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Knowledge is Power. By way of an introduction, my name is Nicole Gordon, and I'm the CEO of Jnetics, a charity that you may or may not be familiar with. I have been with Jnetics since last August, prior to which I have held a number of senior roles within the community. Many moons ago, I studied biochemistry and immunology at Glasgow University and completed a research post at Imperial College, hence my passion for this wonderful organisation. I am presenting this evening alongside Dr. Juliette Harris, who is a specialist genetic counsellor at Northwick Park Hospital. Juliette was also appointed to our Board of Trustees just 6 months ago, so welcome, Juliette. Before we start this evening, Juliette and I would like to thank all 4 participating shulls for helping us put this evening together. A special mention goes to Darcy Richmond. Just a few housekeeping points. Firstly, the session is being filmed, but we won't be focusing on any individuals, so don't worry. Please could you all mute yourselves for the duration of the talk. Any questions you have, if you want to put them in the chat during the course of the evening, Juliette and I will try and answer them either during the time that we're talking or afterwards. And finally, the subject matter that we're presenting this evening is pretty sensitive. If you have a personal story or a personal question you would like to ask or share, we advise you to contact us privately afterwards. I am going to start this evening by sharing with you a short film which I hope will put into context the importance of the work that Jnetics do.
Our son Benjamin was born in 1978. He was diagnosed at 5 days old with cystic fibrosis. He had to have at least 1 or 2 hours physiotherapy every day and lots of very unpleasant treatment. Despite that, he actually had a good life. He loved sport. He ended up at Cambridge studying medicine, qualified as a doctor. At 23, he married his childhood sweetheart and was married for 3 years. On the 2nd of October 2005, at the age of 26 and a half, he died very suddenly from the effects of cystic fibrosis.
Our friends had gotten tested during their pregnancy. They had discovered that they were both carriers of a Jewish genetic disorder. We heard about a screening in our synagogue. Richard went to that screening. We got a letter through the post to say Richard was a carrier of Taysachs when Leah was about 12 weeks old. I went straight to Guy's Hospital and I got tested as well, being told I was also a carrier. They said to us, bring Leah down and get her tested as an absolute emergency. And then we somehow left the hospital and got back home, and we basically sat there. It was just the worst 48 hours of our lives.
We agreed that we would come in on Wednesday afternoon.
Somehow we got ourselves to Guy's Hospital. We walked in the door, we could tell straight away that it was all fine. Our lives restarted again.
Us both knowing that we're carriers isn't going to stop us having further children, but it just means we can now take the steps that we need to take. And if Leah had Taysachs, it's not a question of she could have a life and continue her life. She would have died.
The Genius programme is designed to ensure that so far as possible, the most common life-threatening Jewish genetic disorders disappear from the UK community.
We didn't know about screening until it was, if you like, too late.
Without the programme, people will be completely unaware of these, and it's empowering the person to allow them to make their own decisions. It means they have the knowledge.
And why on earth would anybody want to take a risk? Why does anybody want to bring up a child that is very unwell, that suffers and may die at a very young age?
I don't think any parent should have to go through what me and Lauren have gone through, and this is a way to prevent it.
If people realised the devastating consequences of having a child with one of these disorders, they would not think twice about taking the necessary precautions.
Nicole, you need to unmute.
Okay, so Jnetics is a true hidden gem within our community. There are many charities, each one truly deserved of the cause it supports. But for me, Jnetics truly stands out from the crowd, quite simply because of the simplicity and the uniqueness of its mission statement. And here you can see the mission statement. Jnetics exists to make a real difference to the prevention, diagnosis, and management of Jewish genetic disorders by raising awareness and facilitating access to the best available information, services, and support for those affected at risk. Quite simply, Jnetics exists to save lives. Next slide, please. Now let me start by giving you a little bit of background to Jnetics. Jnetics was established back in 2010, originally as an education-based charity. It was, and still is, the only cross-communal charity in the UK devoted to the prevention of Jewish genetic disorders. So what is a Jewish genetic disorder? A Jewish genetic disorder is a disorder that is more prevalent in the Jewish community than the rest of the population. 1 in 5 Ashkenazi Jews carry the faulty gene for one of the 9 genetic disorders that Jnetics screen for. Why and how they occur, I will leave to our expert, Dr. Harris, to take you through just a little later on. Since we started screening in 2017, we have screened over 4,000 young adults and identified at least 4 carrier couples. What is a carrier couple, you may ask yourselves? A carrier couple is a couple where both partners carry the same faulty recessive gene, for example, for Taysachs, and therefore any future children will have a 1 in 4 chance of displaying the genetic illness. As I pointed out, we currently screen for 9 of the most recessive genetic disorders, and you can actually see them in the diagram on the right. But we do have plans to expand the panel later this year to include a number of conditions that are prevalent in the Sephardi community, as well as further life-threatening and life-shortening genetic disorders that are prevalent in the Ashkenazi community. That's further disorders. The ones we screen for at the moment are prevalent in the Ashkenazi community. Looking at this diagram, I'm sure most of you will have heard of Taysachs and cystic fibrosis, but the others, unless sadly you have been directly affected in some way or another, you may never have heard of them. Next slide. So where do we screen? We screen through 2 channels. The first is the Genius programme, which is our screening programme targeting Year 12 students in Jewish secondary schools and universities through the UK. Some of you may have had children or grandchildren screened through this programme. It is fully subsidised by Jnetics, and at £300 per child, we have to fundraise really hard to meet these costs. Since the onset of COVID, we have moved to a totally virtual screening process, which Juliette is going to take you through later on. This has worked really well and has offered us greater opportunities in terms of the numbers we can screen and the geographical reach we can cover. A great example of this was last November, when we ran our first virtual university screening programme. In the space of 1 week, we managed to screen 252 Jewish students across 58 different educational centres. Through that programme, 43 of the students were identified to be carriers of at least one of the recessive genetic disorders, giving them the knowledge and the power to make the right choices when the time is right. In fact, one lucky student was actually found to be a carrier of 3 of the 9 genetic conditions that we screened for. Our second channel is through the Jnetics Clinic, which targets young adults of 21 plus who are perhaps closer to the age of beginning to think about starting a family. Although partially subsidised, this is a paid-for service and costs the screening participant £250. The clinic, once again, is now totally virtual and runs twice per month. All bookings can be made on the Jnetics website. At this point, I'm going to pass over to Juliette to take you through the next few slides.
Thank you, Nicole. It's lovely to be here with all the shuls, and especially my own shul, Radlett United. So I'm going to talk today in more detail about Jewish genetic disorders, what they are, how they came to be, and what we can do about them. So Jewish genetic disorders are more common in people of Jewish ancestry relative to the general population. So for example, Taysachs disease is increased 10 times in our population, but it does occur in non-Jewish populations. And every ethnicity that we know of has certain diseases that are more prevalent in them. This is not just a Jewish phenomenon. So for example, sickle cell anemia is increased in the African population. And I always tell people in my clinic, sometimes it feels as Jews that we have an extra burden of genetic disease. And I don't agree with that at all. I don't think that is the case. It might seem like that, but one of the reasons it seems like that is we have been more studied than many populations in the world. And this is for these reasons. We live urban lives very close to major medical centers. We're very accessible and open to research. We practice endogamy. We tend to marry amongst ourselves. And so for these reasons, we're incredibly well studied. So basically anything that can be found in us has been found in us. So that's one of the reasons that we have quite a panel of Jewish genetic disorders, so to speak. The next point is obvious, is that Jewish genetic disorders are associated with ancestry. It's where we come from and not to do with how observant we are as Jews. But it's worth remembering that people who are not affiliated with the community may not be aware that they are at increased risk of Jewish genetic disorders. Jewish genetic disorders are present in the Ashkenazi and Sephardi Mizrahi community. We will be discussing today those increased in the Ashkenazi community. For reasons that I've just mentioned, the Ashkenazi community has been extremely well studied, and 95% of Jews in the United Kingdom are Ashkenazi. However, Jnetics has put that to one side and is about to expand the panel to include Jewish genetic disorders in both the Sephardi and Mizrahi community so that everybody of Jewish ancestry in the United Kingdom can access screening. That's happening later in the year. But for this talk, I will mainly be discussing the Jewish genetic disorders that pertain to the Ashkenazi community. Next slide, please. So where did Ashkenazi Jews originate from? Well, we know historically that we have come out from the Middle East. There's been an awful lot of movement out of the Middle East centuries ago, and then more recently back to the Middle East. Genetic data is really interesting. It backs up this theory. So when you look at the genes of Ashkenazi Jews, we have a unique genetic profile that no one else has in the world. We definitely have a mixture of European genes, but also Middle Eastern genes as well. And interestingly, I'm sure a few of you are thinking, but you've heard about Kohanim. So the Kohanim have ancestry going back to the temple times from the priests. And interestingly, Kohanim is passed from father to son, but also the Y chromosome is passed from father to son. And so we know there are genetic variants on the Y chromosome in Kohanim, which are unique to people from Middle Eastern ancestry, and it looks like the Kohanim have emerged, today's Kohanim have emerged from just 5 people, 5 ancestors between 1,000 and 4,000 years ago. So I think it's really fascinating when you think about what we know or think historically, and it gets borne out by DNA and genetic studies. I think this really adds weight to this kind of the information that I'm giving you. So next slide, please. So I'm going to explore our genetic heritage a bit more closely. I'm going to look a little bit more in detail with you around Taysachs, which is probably the most well-known of the conditions that are increased in our community. As we've already spoken about this evening, Taysachs is really a tragic disease. As the Kaiser said in the video, you wouldn't know at birth that a baby has Taysachs. It appears totally normal until they're about 6 months of age. And then unfortunately it develops seizures and blindness, and neurologically can develop no further. And they always pass away by a few years' time. There is no cure at all. So for this disease, it's inherited in an autosomal recessive inheritance fashion. I can see some of you glazing over, worrying about your GCSE biology or O-levels. I'm just going to very briefly explain what this means, autosomal recessive inheritance, and what it means to be a carrier, because this is exactly what our whole carrier screening program is about. So basically, we have thousands of genes, and each gene in our body codes for a protein. There's a specific gene called HexA that codes for a protein that's really important in the brain. Someone who is a carrier of Taysachs has a working copy of this gene and a non-working copy. It doesn't work because there is a mutation or a genetic alteration on it. But a carrier is healthy with respect to Taysachs and has no symptoms at all. But the only problem is if it's a carrier of Taysachs has a child with another carrier of Taysachs. And there's a 1 in 4 chance that that couple would have a baby with Taysachs, because the baby did not inherit a working copy of the gene. So there's a 1 in 2 chance for a couple who is a carrier couple to have a baby who's also a carrier just like them. So that's a reminder of what we mean by autosomal recessive inheritance. Very important to stress that carriers are not affected by the disease for autosomal recessive diseases. So what about Taysachs in terms of screening? So there's been screening in the United Kingdom from about the 1980s. A few of you, quite a few people on this Zoom may have had Taysachs screening themselves, maybe 1980s, 1990s. And it was mainly done through Jewish care. But thank goodness in 1999, the NHS approved it in terms of funding for it. And to this day, somebody who has got Ashkenazi ancestry can go to their GP and ask for screening and referral through their local regional genetic centre. And that still occurs today, but only for Taysachs. That's the only thing approved and paid for by the NHS for our community. Next slide, please. So why is Taysachs increased in Ashkenazi Jews? Why is sickle cell anemia increased in Africans? What is the process by which this occurs? So here's a little diagram. It's I'm going to talk about founder effects. And the little population on the left, the little green dots on the left, represent a growing population. And amongst that population, by chance, there will be, for example, carriers of the disease. Now, I wanted to just comment that its normal state of being is to be a carrier of a genetic disease. We are all carriers of genetic diseases. If in that population, by chance, there's a couple of carriers, but if that population then has a population crash, that could be because of migration, immigration, migration, disease, pogrom, war, famine. And if that suddenly that population on the left crashes, what you'll get is that yellow bottleneck. You'll just get a few survivors. It's called a bottleneck. And if by chance in that yellow bottleneck there are a number of carriers, say of Taysachs, so that you can see there's quite a few Taysachs carriers just by chance in the little surviving population. And when that population grows again, those carriers will be disproportionately represented in that growing population. And therefore, for example, for Taysachs, there will be more children born with Taysachs in that new population of that bottleneck. So that's how this occurs, how it occurs that certain diseases are increased in certain ethnicities. It's like this is a sort of very common occurrence. And actually, in terms of bottleneck, again, we have our geneticists and the data to thank, because when we look at the data, we look at Ashkenazi Jews, it looks that most of us came from 350 people, just 350 people, around 700 years ago. There was a bottleneck crash, and that means that most of us have some degree of relatedness because we all came from people not so long ago. But even with the bottleneck theory, it still doesn't add up. So for example, we know there are more sickle cell anemia carriers than there should be. And we now know that actually sickle cell anemia carriers are resistant to malaria. That's very important in Africa. And there is a theory that the Ashkenazi Jews, where they lived with a lot of tuberculosis, a lot of diseases in the Haim, back in Eastern Europe. And there is a theory that being a carrier of Taysachs actually makes you, protects you from tuberculosis. So that there might be almost a selective advantage, a clinical advantage to being carriers for some of these conditions. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about the Jewish genetic disorders. Next slide, please. So for the thank you. So for the purpose of this talk, I have divided certain Jewish genetic disorders into 3 groups. The group on the left are inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion. I'm not going to give you another biology lesson, but it basically means you can be affected in one generation, and then you can have someone affected in the next generation and the next generation. This is very different to autosomal recessive inheritance. The best known autosomal dominant condition in the Ashkenazi population are BRCA-associated cancers. That's cancers that are caused by mutations in the BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene, which I'm sure many people on this call, on this Zoom have heard of. So having a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation increases the risk of a person to develop in their lifetime breast or ovarian cancer. But people with BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations fortunately have options. They have options in terms of being under good management and surveillance and screening, and they have surgical options as well. And obviously you find out if someone is a BRCA1 or BRCA2 carrier by genetic testing. Now, a lot of people don't know that anybody in the Ashkenazi community, any woman who has had breast cancer or had ovarian cancer, a certain type of ovarian cancer, can have genetic testing for BRCA1 and BRCA2. And people don't realize that. And they need to go to, if they want to, they should go to their GP. And if they want to have genetic testing, they can access it through their GP referral to their local genetic service. Now, for people who have not had cancer themselves, but they feel that there maybe is an increased risk in their family. Maybe there is quite a few numbers of people with breast and or ovarian cancer. Maybe people got breast cancer at a very young age. Maybe there's just a lot of people, a strong family history. They may be eligible for genetic testing too. There are certain criteria, but in order to find that out, they should speak to their GP, who will refer them for genetic testing to see if it's suitable for them. So I'm not going to cover this further in this talk today. It's an incredibly important topic. And in the future, Jnetics is looking very seriously at whether there is a strategy for the Jewish community in the United Kingdom to access population-based BRCA screening. So this is a future directive that could happen. But for now, please, sorry.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt 1 second. Darcy, can you switch, Juliette, I don't think it's the focus of the screen, and she's the one who's talking. Can you switch over, Darcy? Sorry, someone just asked me, but I'm not in control of the screen. Is that better? Okay.
Can you see the slide set though?
Can see the slide set, but I think when you're speaking, you went to the center. That's better, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Apologies.
So all good? Yeah. So all I wanted to say is we'll be looking at this further as a charity. In the meantime, please do speak to your GP if you're concerned about your own risk. The Jnetics website has got excellent information, giving you more information about BRCA screening and testing. So please do go on the website if you'd like to look further into that. I'm now going to talk to you about the next group of conditions, the next middle. If you just move one ahead, thank you. Lovely, yeah, no, one back. We're just going to go back and one back. Thank you. So this group is a group of conditions. It's also autosomal recessive, like Taysachs. As you can see, it's relatively common, these conditions, but they are very variable, and there are medications and cures and treatment for these conditions. Again, if anyone's concerned that this might be in their family, then please feel free to speak to your GP because you may be eligible for testing. The final group, one along please. This third group that I put together, these are 9 conditions. They are all inherited in an autosomal recessive fashion. They're all very serious. They are all life-limiting, all life-threatening, and childhood onset. They are all increased in the Ashkenazi community. And these are the 9 conditions that Jnetics screens for. When we talk about Jnetics screening, these are the 9 conditions we're referring to. These are perfect and suitable for carrier screening program, both in students and in the adult clinic. Next slide, please. So the writing might be quite small to you, and I don't expect you to be able to read it. For those who can, I can just have a little glimpse at how serious these conditions are. But actually, I want to draw your attention to the numbers. We've talked about 1 in 25 people who are fully Ashkenazi are carriers of Taysachs disease. And if you look across, 1 in 100, 1 in 89, 1 in 100. So you might think some of these are quite rare, and you might be surprised that they're part of a screening program. But actually, if you add up all those numbers to find out what's the chance of someone who's on the screening program coming back as a carrier, next slide, please. Actually, in reality, 1 in 5 people who have genetic screening for those 9 conditions, 1 in 5 people who is fully Ashkenazi will come back as a carrier of one of the conditions. So I'm thinking that probably there's 30 people on the Zoom, probably more. There's quite a few people within one camera, but that means that maybe 7 or 8 people here on this Zoom are carriers. Sorry, I can hear somebody talking, but 7 or 8 people within the Zoom could be carriers, and I'm probably thinking most of you don't even know that. So this is so important, this screening, given the numbers. And for 20 years, in America, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Israel, they've screened for a panel like those 9 conditions, not just Taysachs. And as I mentioned before, there was no equivalent in the UK except for Taysachs until Katrina Sarig set up Jnetics in 2009. Within 5 years, we were doing screening for all these 9 conditions. And 6 years on, as Nicole said before, we've screened over 4,000 people, which is an amazing achievement. But when you think about it, there are 280,000 Jews in this country. Okay, so we're talking about possibly as many as 40,000 carriers, most of whom are not aware of their risk. So I'm just trying to give you an idea of the importance of Jnetics doing this work, but also the importance of reaching out to as many people as possible. So next slide, please. How do we actually do the clinic? So anyone with 1 Ashkenazi Jewish grandparent or more are eligible to have genetic screening. And the way that they can do it, you don't need to go to the GP. This is totally self-referral. You organize it yourself. And it is so simple because it's all online. You just go online and book their appointment. They'll have to fill out a questionnaire, family history, or information about yourself. Then Jnetics posts a screening pack to you. There's an allotted time that's allocated to you. The Genetic Council calls you at the chosen time, and I believe it's all through like a Zoom now. And then you have your counselling, and then you return your screening pack, and you get the results 8 to 10 weeks later. It is that easy. And that is, if you want to tell people about it, the website for screening is on the bottom of this page. I'm going to home in a little bit, just to give you a little bit of information about what actually happens during that 20-minute call. What does the genetic counsellor actually discuss? Next slide, please. And this process, by the way, is the same whoever you are, a university student, a school student, or a participant in the Barnet Clinic. It's the same information for everyone. We will discuss the risk that we've discussed today about what the chance of being Jewish and a carrier is. We'll go through the family tree next. And we'll find out, is there anyone in the family affected? Is there anything we should be flagging up to the laboratory? Next, please. We'll talk about autosomal recessive inheritance and what it might mean if 2 people are carrier of the same condition. Next. And then we'll briefly talk about what are the options for a carrier couple. So a carrier couple has options available to them. They can choose whatever is right for them as a family if they wish to avoid having a child with one of these genetic disorders. And the way they can do that is through prenatal diagnosis to see if the baby is affected or not, or through a specialized form of IVF called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, where only embryos are implanted in the womb after IVF that are free of disease. Next. So once we've given all this information, it's a person's choice whether to have the testing or not. So they sign the consent form if they wish to go ahead with testing. Next. They simply spit in a saliva pot. It really is that easy. And from the saliva, they take out cheek cells and they take out DNA in the lab, very clever, and do all this testing. Next. And then 8 to 10 weeks later, results, comprehensive letter and report is sent out to the person. If someone is a carrier, they have the option. All students are given arranged a follow-up appointment with a genetic counsellor, and anyone can arrange an appointment to discuss their findings. I'd like to point out actually that for people who are pregnant, this whole thing is expedited to about 2 to 3 weeks. But about 1 in 5 people in clinic, of the adults that we see in clinic, are pregnant. And that means they can't have all the choices available to them. They wouldn't be able to opt for IVF, for example. So it's really important to try and get screening done before people start planning a family. And I'd like to say something else, which is connects the video at the beginning. I mentioned that couples who have carried couples have got options now to have prenatal testing or IVF, for example. And whenever I hear the Kaisers speak, Lauren and Richard, they're the ones with that beautiful little girl tell their story. They talk about the fact that actually, because these options were available to them, they have now gone on to have absolutely beautiful little twins that they knew from the get-go would not have Taysachs. So that's just completing the story of the video that you heard earlier, because they have these options during this screening process. And I think that's pretty much all I've got to say today. Lots of facts and scientific information. I hope it it was helpful. But actually, I'm thinking back to the Kaiser story of the Taysachs story that we showed on the video, and it does give me goosebumps, because I wrote down the words he wrote. He said that he just heard about the screening. He happened to hear about the screening, and because he just happened to hear about the screening, a chance conversation meant that they went from potentially a tragic outcome to this incredibly beautiful family they have, free of Taysachs. And I just think that, we never know what chance conversation might lead to a completely different and wonderful outcome compared to what could have happened. And so as a geneticist, as somebody who's worked with these families, I think that each person here could have a chance conversation with someone else that can make all the difference. You might never know it'll make all the difference, but it could. It's an incredibly powerful position that we are as Jews to be able to advocate this screening to other people. So that's all I've got to say for now. I'm going to pass back to Nicole, who's going to tell you more about our partners and who we work with and how you can get involved. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Juliette. And also, I think, playing to your point, it's important to say that although I commented that we've identified 4 carrier couples to date, we actually never get the results. So we are actually relying on the couples coming back to us and sharing their stories, and that's how we get our information. So in fact, there could be a whole lot more than 4 couples and many more beautiful babies out there. Sorry, next slide, please. So for Jnetics, engaging with the wider community is key. We work very closely with all the synagogue movements and stakeholder organisations that are working in our space. We also have a database of around 300 volunteers. Many of them are scientific and medically trained, and they help with the actual screening events that we run. We're a very small team. We're only 3 full-time staff and 2 part-time, so we quite simply couldn't manage with all the wonderful volunteers and trustees that we have on board. We offer training to healthcare professionals and GPs, as well as rabbis and community leaders. As I said earlier, our Genius programme, which runs in 8 mainstream Jewish secondary schools across the UK, is fully subsidised by Jnetics. Our young professional programme through the Jnetics Clinic is partially subsidised. We as a team have to work exceptionally hard to raise the funds to continue to deliver the programme annually. In the last year, like many other charities, we have had to be extremely innovative in the events we run. Some good examples of this are back in February, we ran a Zoom Gene and Tonic event, which was attended by about 150 people. So that was quite innovative and seemed to go down really well. And in January, we took over the month of January, we renamed it Genuary, and we did a massive awareness building campaign, which actually we saw a direct correlation between screening appointments that were booked. So it obviously had a direct impact out there in the community. Next slide, please. This slide just shows some of the organisations that we work with. Please note that Jnetics is totally unique and that we actually work in conjunction with the NHS. Our genetic counsellors are affiliated to London North West University Healthcare. Next slide, please. So just before we finish and take some questions, how can you support us and ensure that we can continue to work towards our mission of reducing Jewish genetic disorders from our community and ensuring that no young couple will ever have to endure the heartache of having a child with one of the life-threatening and life-shortening disorders that genetics screen for? So how can you help us? Sign up as a volunteer. We have 300, but there is room for many more. Sponsor our appeals. There's 4 shows on board here. It'd be absolutely great if some of the shows were considering supporting Jnetics as part of the High Holiday appeals. Why not participate in, we have just set up a young professional committee. So if there's any young professionals on this call who would like to get involved, please be in touch with us. We would love to have you. Why not participate in some of our wide variety of fundraising events? If you're not following us on social media, please do. Social media is really, really important for Jnetics. And if you're feeling particularly energetic and would like to do something at the end of May, we have a Jnetics cycle, which is a 180-mile cycle across the Lake District. We do still have some spaces, so if you're interested, please be in touch. But perhaps most importantly, what can you do for us? Please continue to spread the word to all young Jewish adults about the importance of getting screened and eradicating Jewish genetic disorders to ensure that more healthy babies can be born into our community. If you're on this call and you're of the age to be screened, please do so. Please sign up immediately after. If you have children or if you have grandchildren or friends who have not yet been screened and should do so, please get them to be in touch with Jnetics. I think that's it from us, but please fire away with any questions.